Welcome to Salted Hash. I'm J.M. Porup, filling in for Steve Reagan. The midterm elections are coming up soon, and security is much on everyone's mind. I'm here with Juliette Beauchamp, a content producer here at IDG, to talk about election security.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot that's going to be going on, and with the midterms just a few weeks away, it's all pretty interesting. So could you tell us a little bit about why this is such a hot topic right now, and maybe what has happened in the past, even just in the 2016 election, to sort of prompt discussion?
Sure. Well, so there was many grave concerns about the security of electoral voting machines in 2016. It has been since electronic voting became a thing as early as the early 2000s. There was a rush after the Hanging Chad crisis of 2000 to deploy better solutions that would avoid that problem. And in the process, we've created a system of electronic voting arguably worse than the Hanging Chad problem that they were designed to solve. And the kind of disappointing thing is that electronic voting machines properly designed and deployed can be more secure than paper ballots, but at present they raise serious questions about the validity of the election results in a few weeks.
Absolutely, and it's kind of interesting that as we've sort of progressed with technology, you would think that it's a natural step to make voting electronic and maybe even online, but that doesn't really seem to be the case.
No, so electronic voting has such a unique security profile. Like, let's talk about, people say, you know, I can bank online, why can't I vote online? And, you know, what are the consequences of your bank getting hacked? I mean, banks have massive security resources, and as a consumer, you're generally not liable as long as you haven't, you know, given your card to somebody. You're generally not liable for fraud committed without your consent or knowledge. But voting has such a unique and important profile because without voting we can trust, our elections don't have value. Like I attended a talk in June in New York by some of America's leading election security experts, and they said, look, you know, the point of an election is not to pick the winner. The point of an election is to convince the loser they lost. Because if you don't have a loser who's like, yeah, I lost fair and square, then you have chaos. You don't have a democracy, you know?
Mm-hmm.
You can't have ballot stuffing going on and still call yourself a democracy. It doesn't work that way.
Absolutely, and it's funny that you bring up something like ballot stuffing because that's obviously something that, you know, was perhaps an issue with paper ballots, and it's interesting that we still sort of have that problem. What has election security been like even before we had electronic voting?
Yeah, so I mean, one common response in the last 2 years to the revelation, or should I say the more general awareness of security issues with electronic voting is like, let's just do paper. Like it seems like the natural and obvious solution, you know, electronic voting isn't secure. Let's just go back to the way things were, you know, back in the old-timey days when, you know, whatever. But it's not as simple as that because when you're counting 300 million votes and you have like, you know, the water commissioner on the ballot and half a dozen judges who you've never heard of, and you have this ballot that's just like, you know, it's like doing your taxes. Counting those ballots at scale is like a serious problem. Like if you're Los Angeles County or something, that's just a nightmare. So the idea that hand counting, even by genuinely honest and sincere individuals, you know, honest people make mistakes. And when you're counting, you know, 1 million ballots, error is going to happen, you know, and there are security issues both with paper ballots as well as with electronic voting, as we've seen, you know, actual ballot stuffing historically.
It's really interesting that this is still sort of a problem. It seems like it's pretty ongoing and pretty true of most of our elections. I know that there's been some steps to sort of change something and make election more secure, especially in time for the midterms, but that hasn't necessarily worked out, and in some cases it's fallen through. What are some examples of what states have been at least trying to do to change security with midterms, and how that is, okay, maybe it's a great idea, or that is an absolutely terrible idea, and that's going to do nothing for election security?
Yeah, it's a great question. So some states were able to decertify some of their insecure voting machines in the last 2 years. And I think it would be fair to say that the security posture of the 2018 elections is at least marginally more secure than 2016. That doesn't inspire confidence. You know, like they all should be secure. You know, and certainly some states, more than other states, have made a really big effort to up their game. Some states have not. You know, West Virginia, for instance, implemented online blockchain voting a couple months ago, leading to security experts to just howl in despair, because there's really no such thing as a secure online voting, much less on the magical blockchain, which solves nothing really. And then the state of Georgia, one of the largest states with all-state electronic voting, with no audit trail, no paper trail, no way to recount results. A citizens group sued the state saying, you know, this is not acceptable, you know, we need to fix this. And a couple weeks ago, a state judge in Georgia sympathetically agreed but ruled against that citizen group, saying, you know, it's too close to the election, we still have to have an election. And this judge publicly called the state of Georgia as having their head in the sand about the issue. So we're seeing different states responding differently to this particular problem.
And Georgia is one of actually 5 states that has this sort of all electronic and voting together. All electronic voting system that doesn't have a paper record. And it looks like it's joined with New Jersey, South Carolina, Louisiana, and one other state. This is from information from Verified Voting with the Wall Street Journal, NPR. So it's interesting that these 5 states have it. Do you foresee them, for perhaps Georgia will sort of change from online voting, do you foresee other states joining Georgia in changing the way their elections are run? Definitely not in time for the midterms, but maybe in time for the 2020 elections.
Oh, I think it's inevitable. There's so much public awareness now, and so much public pressure that you know, and awareness is growing rapidly. You know, I've been watching this space for 10, 15 years, and security people have been saying this loudly since the Help America Vote Act was passed, you know, in the early 2000s. And it's only just since 2016 that the general public has finally caught on to this. Is actually a really serious issue that threatens the integrity of our elections, and I think that public pressure is only going to continue to grow. For the last 2 years, DEF CON, the security conference in Vegas, has hosted a voting village where ordinary people who attend DEF CON can hack voting machines that the researchers have purchased off of eBay. And many election officials went this year, and they were like, that's the voting machine that I use in my county, and I just hacked it in 5 minutes. You know, and they're like, wow, this has to change, because they just didn't know. I mean, they're not technical people, they're not security people. They're just like, I run a county board of elections for a small county in, you know, Nebraska. You know, like, it's not realistic to expect these people to be security experts. But that realization, that awareness is growing rapidly, and that's heartening. That's heartening.
It is good that people are becoming more aware of these kinds of things, but at the same time, it's sort of discouraging and upsetting that our elections would be something that could be hacked. Even though we don't necessarily have concrete evidence of an election ever being hacked, there's certainly speculation. And it's interesting how election security has changed from sort of more of a domestic threat of, you know, the other party stuffing ballots and something that's done domestically, and now there sort of seems to be a more international threat. Am I wrong there, or is that?
Well, certainly. I mean, if you wanted to stuff ballots in the 1960 election and you're Russia, you're kind of out of luck. You know, I mean, like, but the thing with the internet and security is you now live next door to every sociopathic gangster, spy, and terrorist on the planet. Which means that the entire threat model has changed. It used to be the real threat was the other party or a corrupt government, you know, and there have been corrupt state, and like Richard Daley, 1960. You know, there are plenty of examples of corruption in American history. You know, the machine bosses of New York and Boston of the turn of the 20th century, for instance, and certainly the results of American federal elections are of great interest to other nations. And certainly, I mean, we also can't avoid talking about that America itself has interfered with and hacked foreign elections for 50+ years. You know, so, you know, we can, on the one hand, decry foreign interference in our elections, which is completely unacceptable, but also recognize that it's kind of blowback. It's kind of, if you set that norm as a standard of acceptable international affairs, then, you can't get too outraged when you find it happening to you in return,
That's a pretty fair thing to say. I mean, if we do it, how can we condemn others for doing it?
Maybe we shouldn't do it. I mean, call me crazy, I mean, if we care about democracy and respect freedom, maybe we should care about other people's democracies and their freedoms. I mean, I don't know. Is that a radical thing to say?
It's novel. So let's touch on other nations for a second, because not all of our viewers are watching from the U.S. What have other nations done in terms of election security that are? Is it better than what we have here in the States? Is it worse, or is it just different, or is it just the same?
Well, so I would say that America has really been at the forefront of inventing and deploying electronic voting far more so than other nations. And as a result, that's also made the U.S. more vulnerable to electronic voting hacking than other nations. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. That'll change. I think I haven't followed closely, for instance, what European nations do. I suspect they've been slower to adopt and slower to go electronic. I know that in parts of the provinces in Canada, there's a push for online voting, which security researchers think is dreadful. Like, you cannot secure online voting. It's just not an acceptable solution for democratic voting. So
that's fair. What are the other provinces in Canada doing? What's their typical procedure?
Well, so the federal government in Canada has officially ruled out online voting, but like Ontario, which is Canada's largest province, where both Toronto and the federal capital Ottawa are, so it's a vast province, and there are many remote communities, and the hope of the province is to encourage easier access to voting, like if for the old or infirm or disabled who may not be able to get to voting on election day. And so it comes from a generous place, like everybody should be able to vote, and we want to make it easy for them to vote. Like, that is a fine wish, that is a fine thing to want, and there may be other solutions. Online voting is not one of them. Voting has such unique security properties compared to anything else you might look at, like online banking or, I don't know, anything else. But one particular one that people often forget about is vote buying and voter coercion. There's a reason we have a secret ballot. When you go to vote, you have a secret little cubicle where nobody can see how you vote. You can't have someone say, "Here's $50, vote for so and so. Bring me a receipt proving you voted for so and so." You can't have an abusive spouse saying, "You're going to vote for so and so, or you're going to regret it." You can't have voter coercion. You can't have vote selling. You have a secret ballot where you can vote your conscience and nobody else knows. But if you're voting on a smartphone, then, "Hey, honey, here's how I want you to vote." Or, "Here's $50. I'm going to watch you vote right now." Or, "I'm going to intercept that transmission and change the vote as it's crossing the wire, and nobody's ever going to know." So, yeah, there's very unique properties to voting that are necessary for a trustworthy election. And they're not intuitive, and they're very difficult to get right.
It's interesting that when you think of election hacking and just hacking in general, you automatically assume, something going on in the computer. But I mean, election hacking, if you have something like online voting, can be as simple as someone saying, "Well, I'm going to watch you vote."
Yeah.
And that's still a way to influence an election.
And, I mean, there's all these requirements that are essential for there to be, a free and democratic election. And getting it right is incredibly important and incredibly difficult.
So there's obviously a lot of ways in which there could be a more perfect election system. I'd be interested what your thoughts are about, I know there's some states that just do complete vote by mail. I'm almost positive Washington State is one of them. What about the security of something like that, where people aren't even really obligated to go to the polls? They just fill in a ballot at home, send it in the mail, and it's counted.
That is a good question, and I do not have an authoritative answer to that question. On the cuff, I mean, the thing about the internet and security is that the internet scales. You can do one thing once, copy and paste it a million times. And if you hack a central server, then you can hack all the votes. Now, is it possible to intercept people's mail, steam it open, change their vote, and put it back in the mail? Now, certainly that technology exists and has for at least 100 years or more. Like, people know how to steam open envelopes. Could you do that at scale in a non-detectable manner? That sounds to me very difficult. Now, is it possible? I mean, security is never about perfect security. Trying to achieve perfect security in anything is a fool's errand. But it's a question of how can we make it more difficult? You know, how easy is it to stuff the ballot today when everyone has a smartphone camera and you're not going to get away with it? You know what I mean? Like, if there's like an army of thugs or like changing ballot boxes around, like you kind of think you'd know about it. Like, that would get out. You wouldn't hide that secret.
Yeah.
And if you had like a team of dozens of people intercepting mail in Washington State and steaming open envelopes in some non-detectable way, that requires like a vast conspiracy. Like, one person's not going to be able to do that. Like, that would be really difficult. Impossible? I'm not saying it's impossible, you know, but it would be really difficult. Whereas if you're like finding security vulnerabilities, hacking things in an undetectable manner, then there's no proof. Very difficult to prove anything happened, and it requires a very small number of highly skilled people to pull off. So, you know, I mean, I don't have a concrete answer on the vote by mail, but it would certainly be vastly more difficult to interfere with than online voting, for instance, or electronic voting machines.
Interesting. I'm still so fascinated by any sort of argument which is valid of saying, let's not go with technology on this one, guys.
You know, I mean, one thing that I find frustrating is that, especially in Silicon Valley these days, there's this sort of tech utopian vision that anything we build must be progress. But that's not the case. I mean, there are some technologies that are uniquely evil or are dual purpose. Like, you know, we can talk about the invention of mustard gas. You know, I can't think of any positive uses of mustard gas. And after the First World War, we agreed as a species to ban its use. You know, because, you know, like, German oven makers in the 1930s made massive forward leaps in creating ovens that were used for horrendous purposes. Was that like progress? You know, technology in itself is not inherently good. And I think that we need to take a step back and say we have the power as a species to invent and innovate and deploy some amazing things for both good and evil. And assuming that every possible scientific advance or every possible technological breakthrough is good for us is let's be a little bit more critical about that, because we don't want to be Luddites and say technology is evil, paper ballots, you know, let's go back to the Stone Age, because that's also a ridiculous extreme position. Like we don't want that. I like antibiotics.
Agreed.
You know, I mean, there are wonderful things that technology gives us, but also many evil things. And we can't just be like everything's wonderful, yippity-doo-dah. You know, it's just, you know, so a little bit more critical thinking goes a long way.
Absolutely. And something that you said earlier, which is interesting and something that I hadn't really thought about, is that an election isn't proving who won, it's convincing the loser that they lost. It makes complete sense when you think about it, but in those cases where an election is super close, within, let's say 1 percentage point, how can election security help in having a secure election help in recounting votes? I mean, it happened in 2016. There was a vote recount. So having secure elections and recounting ballots, I would think, is sort of critical to election security.
Great. That's a great question, Juliet. So I've personally spoken in my reporting to half a dozen of the world's leading security experts in this field, and they all agree what the best practice is. Like, this is not rocket science. We know how to do it. It's not hugely expensive. We can deploy it. Take the Georgia system. Georgia is all electronic. A recount is basically, give me that database number again. It's not actually recounting anything. There's no way to audit it. Best practice is that we vote on paper and we use optical scanners. Just like the scanner you have in your office, you like scan a document, you know, whatever. Only you're scanning the ballot paper. Ballot paper goes in a box, just like, you know, old-fashioned. So you fill the paper, you scan it, and you put the ballot paper into a locked box. And the optical scanner counts the votes. Then you do risk-limiting audits. Risk-limiting audits use a statistical model to say, you know, that election was close, and we're going to recount like 5–10% of the total ballots, taking a random sample across all possible votes, and we're going to count that subset to look for anomalies. And if we see anomalies, maybe we'll dig deeper. If there's a landslide vote, that risk-limiting audit might be a very small number of ballots. Like if, if we're all very clear, like that was a landslide, there's no any real doubt, we're just going to do this as a formality. Yeah. If it's a squeaker, like 50.1 to 49.9, you're like, we really need to get this right. You might do 10–20%. You might recount the whole thing if it was that critical. But it's a way of both automating counting votes at scale, which is genuinely hard to get right, and humans are error prone, remember. And also, so it mitigates both the risks of errors and malice with paper ballots, and also mitigates the risk of having those vote totals hacked, because you're checking both, and the two work together to ensure the best possible accuracy in the voting count.
Yeah, I mean, that theoretical seems like everyone would kind of be happy. The loser, if they lost, they can easily audit. It's easy to audit the votes, and it seems like a good option, but why hasn't it been implemented?
It's a question of political will and financial resources. Like, there are many difficult security problems, and some of them are impossible to solve. Some of them are moonshot difficult. This is more like fix the subways so they run on time. Like, we know how to do it. We know how to build subways. We know how to build optical vote scanners. But we need the political will to do it and the financial capacity to actually deploy these systems. We know how to build these systems, but we have to actually, have regulators and governments step up and say, we need to defend the integrity of our elections, and this is how we're going to do it.
So I'll kind of leave everyone with another sort of theoretical question. We're not going to have a perfectly secure election in 2018. That's been made pretty clear by, at the very least, your example of the judge in Georgia. Even if you can have an election that isn't perfectly secure, but it's still correct, like it's still accurate. Like, you can have an election that isn't completely secure, but that doesn't mean it's going to automatically get hacked. But what I want to say looking forward is there an option to have a perfectly secure election? Is that within reach, or is that just, there's always going to be at least some risk of hacking or interference?
Well, there's no such thing as perfect security, as viewers and readers of CSO Online know. But the thing is that we're not anywhere close enough to be quibbling about, minor details. There's this vast gulf between the current status quo and the best practices we know how to deploy and could deploy if we had the political will. Let's get there and have best practices deployed, then we can quibble over minor details. Right now we're in a position where an adversary could hack the Georgia state vote total and nobody would ever know. That's just not an acceptable place for us to be in.
Agreed.
Call me crazy.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming in, JM.
Thanks, Juliet.
There's a lot to think about, and it's really interesting. I think it's going to be something to look at going forward.
Absolutely, and viewers interested in learning more can go to CSOonline.com and follow our security coverage there.